There we go. Okie dokie. Lovely stuff. Thanks. Well, welcome to this Experts at Work, which is beautifully entitled from Rupert, not my title. Love it. Lost in Transformation. Look, I can't even say it. Lost in Transformation. Discover the leadership blind spots derailing change. This session's for members of all three of our networks. We are recording this session, as you just heard. And a big welcome to Rupert Brown, CPO and author. Hooray! Fantastic stuff. So, Rupert's a member of the People Director Partnership and has published his first book. This is your first book, isn't it? I just suddenly
It
realised.
is, it
Yeah.
is, yeah, yeah. And my wife says it's my last one as well.
Okay. Some culture change needed there, by the sound. So Rupert's a CPO who's held senior roles at and advised leading multinationals, including Virgin Media O2, Procter and Gamble, Gillette, and Maersk, who you draw on in the book, which is really interesting, and other businesses across a very wide range of sectors. Lost in Transformation is a candid, research-based exploration of the blind spots that derail even the smartest leaders and most sophisticated transformation programs, and has now been sold in 20 countries, which is fantastic. So it says here to wave the book. So I'm going to wave the book, just like Graham Norton. There's the book, and very nice. The book starts with some really apposite and often witty definitions, which I was going to quote before I saw them on your slide. So I'm going to hold back on those, but they are coming up. But the one I particularly liked, what I will mention, just right for this webinar, is transformation, like change, but bigger and better. So I think that's a really nice way of putting it. Rupert's going to be sharing some ideas and techniques for the first 25 minutes or so, something like that. And then we're going to have some breakout rooms with a really good question from Rupert about how you've experienced change, when it didn't work, why it didn't work, when it did work, why did it, with a hard finish at 2 p.m. So stay with us for the breakout rooms. They're always a good conversation. You'll be in small groups with other network members. Do send us questions and suggestions via chat throughout. We'll send Rupert slides around later. Pop yourselves on mute if you haven't already. And Rupert, over to you. Thank you ever so much for doing this.
Okay, no, thank you, Richard, and thanks everybody for coming. Can you see some slides now?
Yeah, that's absolutely perfect.
Okay. So this is an interesting sort of challenge because I've spent the last kind of 15 months immersed in trying to write a book, and now I'm trying to talk about it in a more engaging way with a few slides, so trying to turn it into a sort of a visual thing. But after a long career in HR with sort of a nose for change and transformation, I really felt it was time to sort of put pen to paper and reflect on what was actually happening for me personally, but also as I started to interview leaders about what went wrong often during periods of change. Because it was just really felt there was a lot of reflection required to get beyond the sort of the rhetoric, of what we often talk about when we talk about change and transformation. So there it is. That's what it looks like. That is a book. I hope you like yellow. That's the color for the slides going forward. And maybe just to frame it, like you said, Richard, let's have a look at some definitions because I think that maybe it just makes the point that I think my take on this book is whilst serious, it's also slightly irreverent to sort of poke a little bit of fun at ourselves and how we think and talk about change and leadership. So my definition of change is broader than just what we do in project management teams in companies, but really that process of anything becoming different, substituting one thing for another. Hopefully, we often talk about change in the positive, hopefully newer or better, but often our experience is different to that. It's not always 100% positive, and we have to find a way through. Um, as somebody who's probably experiencing a midlife crisis as we speak, this was definitely talking to me more in the broader sense of change and the sort of the psychology of it. Transformation, I mean, really, what is that word? We can't outrun it. And at one point, as I told myself, just do not use that word at all. And look, now it's on the front cover. So it is what we often like to talk about. And of course, leadership. Does the world need another book on leadership? I often ask myself that question. But then I thought, well, hang on a minute, really, in the world of HR, often what we do is influence people's opinions and minds and process and policy. We don't necessarily always think of ourselves as the leader of the company, but we cast a long shadow. For me, I really thought that sort of leadership as being a characteristic of a person rather than a position in a hierarchy was an important distinction. And I find it's quite empowering also if you think about yourselves that way. Otherwise, it's very easy to throw tomatoes at leaders and at change and feel like a victim to it, which is this book is much more hopeful and resourceful for that. And along with speaking, I interviewed 30 odd leaders for the book. I also spoke to a number of experts sort of in the world of sort of psychology and philosophy and change. And really actually like this definition of resilience from Jenny Campbell, who talks about the resilience dynamic, which is this our innate capacity for change, the capability to bounce back and take advantage of opportunities, which again I just think feels right for our times. Um, um, Trust is a conversation that we've probably had. You've probably spoken to many people about the changing nature of trust in this digital world, and Rachel Botsman has a lovely definition of that being a confident relationship with the unknown. Which, if you think about what we're trying to do in our organizations and what we're trying to navigate, really it is about trying to conjure up something more positive and less about doing things to other people that they may not enjoy. Blind spot comes from the Johari window model, which you may or may not be familiar with, which is this idea that there is an area which somebody has a lack of understanding. It's unknown to you, but possibly it's known to others. And I think my sort of examination really of what happens when we lock ourselves in project rooms and try and project plan big change and transformation projects is that we immediately cut ourselves off from the rest of the organization. And the question of just how is this being perceived? How will this land? How does this feel? How else might we do it? We create this ginormous blind spot for ourselves. So I hope that gives you a bit of a flavor for the type of insights that I want to share. And when we do get to the breakout, the idea is to sort of have a conversation that's a little bit closer to the bone than we normally have at work. You know, we're amongst friends. This is a safe space. We're talking about the really, reallys. You know, not what we say at the town hall necessarily, but how it really feels to lead change. And people often say, when did you decide that this would be a good thing to do to write a book? Um, it was here. Does anybody know where this is? Anybody want to come off mute and try and say what
Barcelona.
that might
Disneyland.
be?
Barcelona.
Barcelona, yeah.
That is Barcelona, isn't it? That is one of Gaudi's masterpieces. And I was at an off-site meeting in the beautiful Barcelona. That's a real picture. I took that from my phone coming out of a meeting where I was pulling my hair out. And what I couldn't understand was I was working in the transformation team for a large organization. We had what I would probably describe as some of the brightest people I've ever worked with from the most prestigious organizations on the planet, working together to transform the fortunes of a major organization. And we had essentially just dug ourselves in and created this sort of in-group, out-group dynamic between the transformation muscle on the one hand and the rest of the business on the other. And change was being seen as a thing we do to others. We'd weaponized change and transformation. And often it felt like we were describing it as the dark arts of getting revenge on people who ought to know better. And in the book, I describe the sort of the epiphany as, you know, it's almost like we're all pets in the same zoo here. You know, we're all in the same payroll, in pursuit of the same thing. But the warring factions that are created inside organizations. How can it be that we can have all these experts, consultants, best practices, and yet still have sort of no understanding of what it feels like to do change, to experience change, to lead change? And that was that was a few years ago, and I just thought these patterns that I'm seeing just keep repeating themselves time and time again, and it was too good to ignore, really. And every time I woke up for the next 6 months, I said, "There's something to be explored here. There's something to write about." One of the challenges, though, when you research when change goes wrong or leadership when it's not at its best, is that people don't often want to show up like that in your book. So I found that whilst I had to carefully select who I interviewed for the book, I actually had to lead from the front, dig deep into my own experience of what's it like when I find myself, compromised or lost in transformation was the expression that I used, and that's where this notion of blind spots came up. So let's have a look at a few blind spots. Hope you like puzzles. Can anybody see any concepts or words that jump out of this puzzle? Just come off mute and shout it out.
Relationships is there, isn't it? In the fourth line down.
Relationships, yeah.
Flattery. Sorry.
Flattery, yeah. Nice one, thank you.
Notification.
Notification, yeah, wonderful.
Deadlines.
Deadlines, that's a good one. That's upside down.
Ooh.
One more.
Soon.
Soon is, but soon that's not actually mine. I've just got lucky there. Uh, so let's put a few on. So this is these are some of the blind spots I experienced in particular around one major transformation, which was an acquisition. It was the Gillette Procter Gamble acquisition, where I had an unusual seat in that I was both being acquired, I was in the smaller company, and I was also on the clean team that was planning the integration of the two companies. And I stayed with the company 5 years post integration. So got to really sort of really savor this meal in all its delightful complexities. And some of the blind spots that came out, I thought were worth reflecting on. So the notification blind spot came about because I heard about the acquisition on the radio. I was actually in sales at the time. I was driving to Boots in Nottingham to sell them some more more razors. And I turned on the radio and heard that my company had been acquired by Procter& Gamble. And I had to pull over into the hard shoulder. I was so shocked and upset because I absolutely adored the company I was working for. And I just, many years later, thought, is that really the best we can do? Is that the way to notify people about major change? Can we do better? I know sometimes you can't. Sometimes you can't. It's breaking news. Stock market doesn't allow it. Whatever it might be. But if we think about all the other bits of change that we do, we experience, can we be better at notification? The deadlines one came up because how often is it that we create these sort of arbitrary deadlines on any project plan that then when we actually get to the execution of the plan creates this really narrow window of time in which we have to perform multiple somersaults. With the Gillette P&G acquisition, I was actually based in Switzerland at the time, and for the whole sort of economics of the deal to work, they had to set up the new combined company on the first day of the tax year in Switzerland, which was 1st of January 2006. And that's fine, except that the time period it took for the European Monopolies Commission to agree the deal kept getting delayed and delayed and delayed. So eventually we had this wonderful plan we'd been working on all year. And our window of execution was getting narrower and narrower. When we got it November the 1st, we got the permission to do it. And we had 8 weeks, including Christmas, to integrate two organizations, move people around the world, harmonize benefits and terms and conditions of employment, and on it went. And you sometimes think to yourself, to what extent was that deadline self-imposed? To what extent was that the challenge of doing change even harder put on ourselves, sort of for an arbitrary or financial reason? So there's a lot of other pieces that come out, not least the idea that we don't listen to our emotions. It's like this idea that it's just on top of what we do at work, there's a lot of inner turmoil going on. So I described the situation where I'm leading the town halls for the integrated business, encouraging people to stay because it's good for their career. And at the same time, I've just had in a 24-month period, I've lost a relative. We've had our first child, we've had our second child, and it's dawning on me that this is not the company I want to work for. And I'm at the front of a town hall telling everybody about the different culture change models that are out there and how they really should go on the journey because it's good for their career. And this sort of inner voice of, if you don't listen to it or don't do something, you don't do the inner work for yourself at some point, it derails you. And I realized that people don't talk about this. So if it's happening to me, it probably happens to others. And if we're going to talk about sort of a human centric approach to change, then we have to really wake up and consider the whole person, the whole emotional gambit of what's going on, not just a project plan in isolation. So that's again a bit more of a flavor of the angle, and hopefully that tees you up for an interesting breakout. If we look at the territory I sort of covered in the book, then this is the last slide before we do the breakout, Richard. So, but I just want to build it out a little bit. So these are effectively the chapters in the book, and deliberately set in a clock face, because I think the notion of time is a fascinating one when we think about change and work and just life generally, because it's almost like we totally ignore the reality of how long things take, and how long does it take people to get over change or to get on board the bus. And if anybody dare slip back, then we obviously think that they have been unsuccessful in the change journey. So the whole time piece is very central to my sort of self-awareness that goes into this book. But you won't be surprised to see the other words in blue, which are key pillars here, are about trust, are about leadership, and are about crisis. And a crisis can also be an opportunity, as we know. And there's I reflect on a period in my career where I worked for a company going through a cyber attack, which was a very destabilizing period, not just for the business, but for everybody in it. But for this particular example, the leader of who was leading IT at the time, and who actually became sort of the de facto CEO for that period of crisis management, did an incredible job of galvanizing the team and being able to take the technology backbone of the company through several sort of like evolution leaps in one fell swoop. And it really felt like, the expression never let a crisis go to waste really applied for this individual, in part because of his leadership style, which was incredibly taking people on the journey with him, being very much in the trenches with folks. And I just thought that's never been truer. So you don't necessarily need a cyber attack to feel like you're in a crisis. You just need to turn on the news and you feel like you're in a perennial one. But that's the landscape that a lot of us live and work in. So some of the dimensions then that came out in my research with leaders was, whenever you ask a leader about their experience of leading change, they invariably tell you about the good stories. And they immediately go to the mental side, i.e., what was the logic of the plan? They might talk to you about Kotter's 8 steps. They might talk about a framework they learned at business school. And it becomes more about the hard sides of org design. It's the structure, it's the different things that we did in the process. And that's sort of often where it's left off. There's very little consideration given to relating well with other people, and how the character of the individual shows up. The assumption being, well, I'm a good person, I'm a good leader, therefore all must be well from my side. And if anybody who's worked with challenging people in challenging situations, that's not always the case. Sometimes we have to work with some really difficult people who aren't that pleasant, who don't relate well with others, and it might be in a very difficult situation. And I draw on transactional analysis, the parent-adult-child constructs, to help me understand just how hard it can actually be for some people to show up well when they might not actually be that pleasant a person on the inside. And again, there's an interesting piece about dark side personality traits of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, which very rarely they mention in a leadership training course, but we all know, if you've been in HR long enough, you've worked with them, right? You know that exists. Which sort of leads you onto this, well, how self-aware are our people, are our leaders? How self-aware am I? And what role does emotions play in the leadership of change? How do you heighten that? Which is, easier said than done. Being able to label emotions can actually be super challenging. Again, you're always trying to put a positive spin on things. And when is there ever a good time to lower the mood? I can remember presenting a couple of change models in town halls post-acquisition. So, like the Bridges change model, of the idea of there being an ending, a middle zone, and a new beginning. Or maybe it's the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief, 7 stages of loss model, where you talk about anger, denial, depression, and so forth. And it's only ever a cursory put the slide up and then move on, because you know that the leader of that group does not want you to dampen the mood. But the challenge is, how do we find the time to do the inner work to explore this stuff if we're just going to gloss over it and pretend that all is hunky dory? Which leads us on as practitioners to this question of resilience. And I thought it quite helpful to, when I speak to a lot of sort of my peers in the HR world, they'll often talk about the challenges of a toxic workplace. And I wanted to reframe that more positively to say, actually, there's some people, yes, there are workplaces that are toxic, but that's also data in terms of what's going on. And sometimes it's the truth sayers in an organization and not necessarily the people you're talking to, but they can give you some very candid insights as to the reality of what's going on. How we should sort of, rather than saying it's toxic, I'm leaving it alone, it's bad for my health, saying actually, this is interesting, there's a lot going on here. How can I step in and learn more while still having a kind of a bit of a fireproof jacket over yourself to navigate it? So there's a lot. There's a lot of ground I'm covering, and I know that a lot of this is relevant because I've been, tried to do the work for many years, and now trying to help other organizations do it with a slightly more sort of self-awareness and intentionality. And I guess that brings us, if we don't have any questions, that brings us to the breakout. But maybe I should just stop and ask if there's any questions on any of that before we go to breakout.
Hi, just a really quick question from. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Neil. Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, hi, Neil from Noble Foods. Just a really quick question from me. I mean, when I see it on here, it's one of those things that seems really simple, absolutely makes sense, but I imagine it was quite complex to pull this together in this way. How hard was it to make something which outside of a slide deck is quite a complex matter and present it back in a format which is logical and seems quite simple? Because like I said, all of those things are true, but they're spread across the organization. They're brought to life differently by different people, but you've somehow distilled it and put it into something which makes it seem really simple and easy.
Thanks, Neil, for the question. So interestingly, there's no model in the book, and I'm deliberately it's a no model, if you like, because I didn't believe there was a one size fits all. It was very situational, very personal. It's actually only in the production of this slide deck that I've tried to represent it visually. But they do sort of those are, if you like, the chapters of the book, and I found it super difficult to know what goes with what. Essentially, I was trying to make sense of all this research, everything I've read, everything I've researched, everything I've experienced, and also noting that I don't like the change models, right? So I'm trying to create something from scratch. So there was a lot of scribbling, rehashing, and trying to make some sort of meaning of it for myself, which is also why I guess I went with something that made sense to how I'm feeling. Went with the clock, went with the chapters, but there's, to your point, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out, and maybe I won't try and productize it too much, because I think actually the devil is in the detail. It's such a nuance. We're talking about the experience of change, the experience of leadership. You and I will have different experiences, and I would hate to say that there's one way to do it, one way to lead transformation, because there absolutely isn't.
Thanks, Neil. Good question.
Okay. We're good for time. Should we head into the breakouts, Richard? Everyone.
Thanks, everyone. So, how would you like to take this forward in terms of what most struck you in terms of the conversation? There's a couple of things that struck me, but I'm going to keep those up in my back pocket for now. But and perhaps starting with you, Rupert, actually, because you were in the room as well, weren't you?
Yeah, I don't want to say too much because I think there's so much wisdom in the room. Everyone's got these learnings, and I'm almost like encouraging people just to bring them into the consciousness, and then sort of stand by them, defend them. You know, you've been there, you've done it, you've seen it. You know it doesn't work, so why do we let it happen again? There was a lovely conversation about the lies we tell, and when we describe an organizational change as a lift and shift, just to get it past consultation and try and downplay its impact. But of course, if you do that enough, a lot of little things add up. I mean, that's the whole thing about what it really feels like, right? And then the new CEO wanting a new operating model. I mean, it's kind of deja vu. It should also be our bread and butter, but it raises a lot of questions about how do we do that differently and better in the future. But I won't say any more. Over to you. Who else wants to talk?
I'm happy to say something, Richard.
Thanks, Paula.
Rupert, great subject, by the way. I think the thing that came out from our little group was, as a HR teams or people teams, you're expected to be experts in change. It's just assumed, right? And how do you sort of put your face mask on first? I think Kate described it well, which I think is a really good description over when your team is changing. So whether you're going through an acquisition or a big change that requires your team to change, as well as leading the change, that's really hard because it's like a double whammy of change, if that makes sense. And I don't think we came up with some good answers. We were just saying it's just tough, particularly with this underlying expectation that you're also change gurus, change experts, right? There's just this, and most of us actually don't have a lot of, you've got innate change experience because you've
Knowledge. Yeah.
done it, right? And you've got the scars and the t-shirts rather than some degree or qualification over here, right?
And it feels like an unfair monkey's take. You know, when someone says you're the expert at change, it's like, well, we're all human beings. We're all experiencing change together. What would even give somebody expertise in change? I mean, it's ridiculous. And what you end up doing then is just subjugating your own personal experience and putting on a professional mask. So it's like you just swallow it down. It's really unfair, I think, actually. And don't take that. I also mentioned in the book where a leader turned to me and said, we just described a big restructure and said, so then, Rupert, can you make all that happen quickly and quietly? So I should have said no, because that's unreasonable. And it's certainly unreasonable to put on one person. And that's happening to all of us. So it's like, this is nonsense. It's a collective human endeavor. It's not the HR function.
But I imagine there's a tug on your professional pride, isn't it? You feel like you should say yes to, seeing ourselves in your position at that time. I imagine that's quite a familiar thing because a demand is being made on you professionally, which you then try and meet is your instinct. But actually, as you say in reflection, it's too much.
Yeah. You rise to the challenge. I think we often do rise to the challenge, and we let other people off the hook as a result.
Got you. Yeah. Other reflections from people.
Richard, in our group, sorry, Sammy, in our group we talked a lot about communication, and Rupert, you talked about trust and like how important and how difficult it is to establish trust with everyone involved in change because of the necessary secrecy that surrounds some part. But I think actually my own reflection around people sometimes create secrecy where it's not needed, like they don't necessarily draw the line in the right place, and get very nervous about what they can say, so they say absolutely nothing, and so that really undermines trust. And I thought what you just said around the lies that we tell, that was a really sobering comment that you said, because I feel like a lot of platitudes come out. And people are not stupid. None of us are stupid. We can see straight through them. So I think that whole trust, communication, what to communicate when, how to keep communicating, how to maintain empathy, really hard.
Communication did come up on both the rooms I was popping into, and I really like your point, Kate, about we sometimes draw the line, as it were, too high in terms of where you what you can communicate and what you can't. In fact, Penny, can I draw you in here at this point? Because I really like what you were saying, which isn't quite Kate's point, because Kate, yours more about actual operational detail, I think, to an extent, and what you can share or not. But Penny, your point about preparing people, I liked. If I could just draw you on that point.
Yes, so we merge and relocate small businesses all the time. I like to do a session where we talk about how the do you know what I mean? Here's the outcome. This is why we're doing it, but it's going to be tough. Do you know what I mean? And there are going to be difficult bits, and it is going to be painful, but we're going to come out the other side, and we have to hold together, and we'll review it. And the bits that haven't got well, let's talk about it, because then we'll learn from it, and it'll be better next time. And also, I like to point out these are the things that we've learned in previous projects. Do you know what I mean? So we're taking on learnings, but it makes them believe that we will review it and learn from their experience as well.
I like the directness of that, and it's because it's. I just think it sort of frames it very nicely, and it's very honest. And I think I just wonder whether leadership teams can be a little bit tempted to be over positive, should we say? And I think, as Hayley was saying, in the same room, people don't necessarily buy it. They know, there could be trouble ahead. So being honest with that and the way that Penny was describing, I think is really, really powerful. There was somebody else who was going to come in at the same time as Kate. Sorry, that I think I've missed. Apologies. Who was that?
Well, that's me, Richard. I was just going to say to that point around coming back to that point around change management. We're in a situation where we're looking at our operating model, and we were just talking about what exactly do we mean by that. But anyway, we have actually appointed outside of the HR function a change manager to help us through this process. So that specific expertise on the one hand being very helpful, but what I'm finding in my team, to the point around our credibility and experience as well, is that it's not entirely clear what their remit is versus ours. And I think my team are feeling a little bit wobbly about what that means for them, either as being part of this program from an experience perspective, but also what are they going to be doing that we're not going to be doing. So it's quite a tricky kind of piece in terms of understanding our remit in this whole program of change that we actually don't know what it's going to be yet anyway, but we're kind of very early doors. So yeah, I think the point around credibility is really important.
But a lot of ambiguity by the sound of it, at this point anyway.
And a lot of ambiguity at the moment, yes. Yeah.
We also had a chat in our room about the term change management, and it was on the basis of I put something in the people plan about change management, and I got a response saying, can you not put HR fluffy words in the people plan? Yeah. And I said, I kind of tried to explain it, change management isn't an HR thing. So I kind of ended up changing it to business evolution as a kind of area for us to look at. But we had a discussion about the terminology change management, which sounds like you're doing something to somebody, and actually, business evolution or business transformation might be kind of better terminology because it sounds, for the end user, because otherwise it sounds like, you're implementing something on somebody, and people often don't necessarily like that, perhaps.
That makes sense. What do you think, Rupert?
Yeah, this gets really complicated because there's so many different people involved, and with slightly nuanced and different remits. And I have a bit of empathy for the change, those in the change management discipline, because it's often very well intended, but they can often run into problems with people who own parts of the organization, like us in HR. Similarly with the PMO, the project management folks have a similar challenge in that they're trying to chase data and give updates and reassure somebody that we're on track, which is a thankless task. But we all sort of need to work together so that it goes back to this. Do we really know what we're talking about when we say there's an activity on a plan that's going to do something positive? So beyond the double click on the change management. So what does that mean? Because I think a lot of it is well intended and really hard to actually deliver. And change management people are often great at comms writing. And you get this, the reason why I sort of have a bit of a thing about change management is that it often gets pushed further down the organization. And what you're really trying to do is influence leaders and what they think and believe. and how they show up. And if the change and comms people are just writing, reactive FAQs or announcements, we're missing the point. We're missing the value of engagement and communicating in this sort of like credible way. And I often find, unfortunately, the change managers, through no fault of their own, they just get a little bit squashed and pushed down. And if you're at the bottom of the project plan, you're not going to happen. It's sort of my experience.
On a not unrelated note, Kate mentioned about change fatigue. Any thoughts on that? Anybody, Rupert or anyone?
We talked a little bit in our group around comms as well, and almost like the damned if you do, damned if you don't approach. And there's always going to be a bit of dissatisfaction with the messaging. And we were saying, you can have comms where you are transparent and you bring everyone together to say, there is no update at this point in time. We're still working things through. We've got nothing to say. But then people often might not believe that that is the truth and it's being kept secret. And then you have the rumor mill to contend with as well. Or that even then when you do have an update and you can do the right thing and tell people as soon as you know it, the question then immediately comes of what's next, or what does that mean for me? What does that mean for my team? And you can be transparent and give them what they've asked for, but then there's a 10-second reprieve as to what happens next, and we might not know that. So I think there's the resilience of the people who are leading it is really important to keep in front of mind of this, because when we're going through these type of programs, to some extent it's always the leaders and HR locked away in a room together working this through, leaders of varying kind of seniority across the organization, that I think people look to HR to be the kind of go team, empower everyone, be the calm presence throughout. And it can be really taxing on us as well to maintain that for everyone else as well as ourselves when we don't have all the answers, or we might not know the end goal or anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you feel like your organizational conscience, don't you, in a way, and it weighs very heavy on your shoulders. I often think it's better I'd rather have the issues out there so I can see them than believe that if I say nothing, I'm getting away with it. Because that just feels like, we know that's definitely not the case. But similarly, it seems like once you've sort of gone public, it's very hard to please everybody. But in some ways, that I don't know, maybe it's just what's your approach to change? What do you think is important? And trying to find the right balance. I think Richard, over to you. I think we're coming up to our last minute.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just going to say, thanks ever so much, Rupert. Thanks ever so much for coming along, everybody. We've got another one of these on the 18th of November, which is going to be fun. It's a mediation role play. Ex-PwC HR Director John Scott, a mediation expert. 2 volunteers have been secured, so don't worry, you're all safe. They're not here, so I can say that. And it's going to be good fun on that. And then we've got the face-to-face events in November. Bit of a social aspect to that too, so we'll hope to see you there. Rupert, fabulous book. Really enjoyed reading it. Very much recommended to the network. Thank you so much for doing this, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.